January 10th, 1941. The Mediterranean Sea. 60 miles south of Sicily, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious cuts through the blue water, her flight deck gleaming in the winter sun. She is the pride of the Royal Navy. She is the ship that 3 months ago crippled the Italian fleet at Taranto. She is escorting a convoy of merchant ships carrying desperately needed supplies to a tiny island fortress called Malta. The officers on the bridge have seen the intelligence reports. They know the Luftwaffe has moved Fliegerkorps 10 to Sicily. They know the threat is real, but knowing and believing are different things. The Italian Air Force has been a joke for months. The men on deck are not worried. They do not understand what German precision bombing looks like. They do not know that 15,000 feet above them, hidden in the glare of the morning sun, 43 Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers are beginning their attack runs. They do not know that in the next 6 minutes, they are about to experience the most concentrated aerial attack ever launched against a single ship. They are about to discover that the tiny island they are trying to save, a rock smaller than the city of London, is about to become one of the most intensively bombed places the world had ever seen. The Germans are making a calculation. They believe that if they can sink the Illustrious, if they can neutralize the British forces on Malta, if they can starve and bomb that island into submission, they will control the entire Mediterranean. They will cut Britain's lifeline to Egypt. They will secure the supply routes to Rommel's Africa Corps. They will win the war in North Africa without firing another shot on the ground. They believe Malta is weak. They believe Malta is isolated. They believe Malta will fall within weeks. They are wrong. Over the next 2 years, the attempt to destroy Britain's base on Malta will become one of the greatest strategic blunders of the Second World War. The Germans and Italians will drop more bombs per square mile on this tiny island than had fallen on any other place in history up to that point. They will fly over 3,000 bombing raids. They will hurl over 15,000 tons of explosives at a target only 95 square miles in size. They will reduce ancient cities to rubble. They will kill over 1,500 civilians, and they will fail, because Malta will not break. Malta will not surrender, and Malta, the island they tried to destroy, will become the knife that cuts their supply lines in half. It will become the unsinkable aircraft carrier that bleeds Rommel's army dry. It will become the rock upon which the Axis dreams of Mediterranean dominance will shatter. This is the story of how Germany tried to bomb an island into oblivion, and how that island fought back. To understand why Malta mattered, you have to look at a map. You have to see what the generals and admirals on both sides saw when they planned their campaigns. Malta sits almost exactly in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. It is 60 miles south of Sicily. It is 180 miles north of the Libyan coast. It is the crossroads of an ancient ocean, a choke point that has determined the fate of empires for 3,000 years. The Phoenicians knew it, the Romans knew it, the Knights of St. John held it against the Ottoman Turks in 1565. And in 1940, both Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler knew exactly what it meant. For Britain, Malta was the keystone of their Mediterranean strategy. Every ship sailing from Italy to North Africa had to pass within striking distance of the island. Every convoy carrying tanks and fuel and ammunition to Rommel's Africa Corps had to run a gauntlet past British submarines, British bombers, and British torpedo planes based on Malta. Churchill called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier. He was not exaggerating. For the Axis powers, Malta was an intolerable threat. It was a British base planted squarely in the middle of what Mussolini called Mare Nostrum, our sea. It was a wound in the side of every Italian supply convoy. It was the reason Rommel never had enough fuel, never had enough tanks, never had enough ammunition to finish the job in North Africa. In May 1941, Erwin Rommel himself sent a blunt warning to Berlin. Without Malta, he wrote, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa. He understood the math. Every supply ship that went to the bottom of the Mediterranean meant fewer tanks for his panzer divisions, fewer shells for his artillery, fewer drops of gasoline for his trucks. Malta had to be neutralized. Malta had to fall, or the war in the desert was already lost. But in June 1940, when Italy declared war on Britain, Malta was practically defenseless. The Royal Navy had no major warships based there. The Royal Air Force had no modern fighters stationed on the island. The garrison consisted of a handful of infantry battalions and some coastal defense guns designed for a previous century. The entire air defense of Malta, when the first Italian bombs fell on June 11, 1940, consisted of a handful of obsolete biplanes against the entire Italian Air Force. The aircraft were Gloucester Sea Gladiators. 18 of them had been left behind in packing crates at the Calafrana seaplane base, spare parts for the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious that had never been collected. RAF mechanics worked frantically to assemble what they could, scrounging engines from wrecked Blenheim bombers, fabricating parts from whatever metal they could find. They managed to get 6 aircraft operational, but with a chronic shortage of spare parts and only a handful of volunteer pilots, they could rarely put more than 3 in the air at any one time. The Gladiators were obsolete before the war even started. They had open cockpits. They had fixed landing gear. They had a top speed of 257 miles per hour, which was impressive in 1934, but suicidal in 1940. The pilots who flew them were volunteers. They were not fighter pilots. They were transport pilots, reconnaissance pilots, flying boat pilots who had never been in a dogfight in their lives. They looked at the ancient biplanes. They looked at each other. They climbed into the cockpits anyway. For 10 days, in June 1940, those Gladiators were the only thing standing between Malta and destruction. They shot down several Italian aircraft. They disrupted bombing formations. They gave the people of Malta something they desperately needed. They gave them hope, and they proved something that would define the entire siege. They proved that Malta would fight. Months later, after the worst of the early fighting had passed, a journalist for the Times of Malta would give 3 of those Gladiators the names that would make them legend: Faith, Hope, and Charity. The names were not used during the battle itself. The pilots simply called them the Fighters. But the legend that grew around them, the story of 3 rickety biplanes holding back an air force, captured something true about Malta's spirit. The names stuck. They became symbols. And today, the sole survivor of that original flight, the aircraft known as Faith, sits in the National War Museum in Valletta as a sacred relic. The Italians had expected the island to collapse within weeks. They had assumed that a few bombing raids would shatter the defenders' morale, that the population would demand surrender, that the garrison would recognize the hopelessness of their situation and negotiate. They were wrong. Instead, the Maltese people dug shelters into the soft limestone rock. They moved their families underground. They learned to live with the sirens, with the explosions, with the constant fear. And they refused to break. But the Gladiators were not enough. Everyone knew it. The British knew it. The Italians knew it. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler knew it too. By December 1940, the situation in the Mediterranean had changed dramatically. The Italian military machine had proven itself to be a paper tiger. The Italian invasion of Greece had become a humiliating disaster. The Italian offensive in Egypt had been crushed by a British counterattack that captured 130,000 prisoners. Mussolini needed help, and Hitler, against his better judgment, decided to provide it. In January 1941, the Luftwaffe arrived in Sicily. Fliegerkorps 10, the 10th Air Corps, was a specialist anti-shipping unit that had been honing its skills against British convoys in the North Sea and the Norwegian coast. Its pilots were experienced, its aircraft were modern, and its commander had specific orders from Hermann Goering himself: neutralize Malta, sink the British fleet, clear the sea lanes to North Africa. The Luftwaffe brought something the Italians did not have. They brought the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The Stuka was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It had fixed landing gear that housed sirens called Jericho trumpets. When the plane dove, the sirens screamed. The sound was designed to terrify, to paralyze, to break the will of anyone caught beneath it. In Poland, in France, in the Low Countries, the Stuka had been devastatingly effective. It could dive at angles of 60, 70, even 90 degrees, dropping its bombs with an accuracy that level bombers could only dream of. And now it was coming for Malta. January 10th, 1941. The attack on HMS Illustrious began at 12:35 in the afternoon. The Stukas came out of the sun, diving from 15,000 feet. They came in coordinated waves of 3, diving from different heights and bearings to divide the ship's anti-aircraft fire. The first wave dropped fragmentation bombs to knock out the gun crews. The second wave came with 500-kilogram armor-piercing bombs designed to punch through the flight deck and explode deep inside the ship. The attack lasted 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, the Illustrious was hit by 6 direct hits and 3 near misses. The bombs punched through her armored flight deck, the 3 inches of steel that made her a pioneer among aircraft carriers, and exploded in the hangar spaces below. The armor saved the ship from catastrophic flooding. It kept her afloat, but it could not keep the bombs out. Aircraft turned into flaming wreckage. 126 sailors were killed. 91 were wounded. The ship's steering was destroyed. Her flight deck was a twisted ruin of burning metal. But the Illustrious did not sink. She limped toward Malta, steering with her engines alone, trailing smoke and fire, attacked again and again by Italian torpedo bombers. She made it to Grand Harbor in Valletta at 9 o'clock that night, a burning hulk that refused to die. And the Luftwaffe was not finished with her. For the next 10 days, the Germans threw everything they had at the crippled carrier. On January 16th, over 70 Stukas and Ju-88 bombers attacked Valletta in the heaviest raid Malta had ever seen. The target was Illustrious, but the bombs fell everywhere. They fell on the ancient dockyard. They fell on the 3 cities, Senglea, Vittoriosa, and Cospicua. They fell on churches and homes and shelters packed with civilians. They killed hundreds. They wounded thousands. They turned entire neighborhoods into smoking craters. But they did not sink the Illustrious. The ship's crew worked around the clock, repairing what they could, preparing her for sea. The dockers of Malta worked beside them, risking their lives under constant bombardment to load supplies and ammunition. On January 23rd, the Illustrious slipped out of Grand Harbor under cover of darkness and escaped to Alexandria. The Germans had failed. The Illustrious Blitz, as it came to be called, was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Malta. Instead, it was the beginning of something else. It was the beginning of a siege that would last 2.5 years. It was the beginning of a bombing campaign that would drop more explosives per square mile on this tiny island than anywhere else in history up to that point. And it was the beginning of a strategic miscalculation that would cost the Axis the war in North Africa. The problem was that the Germans had other plans. In the spring of 1941, Hitler was preparing for the most ambitious military operation in history. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, would require every aircraft, every tank, every soldier the Third Reich could muster. Fliegerkorps. 10 could not stay in Sicily forever. It was needed on the Eastern Front. And so, at the end of May 1941, the Luftwaffe withdrew from the Mediterranean. They left Malta wounded, but alive. They left the island's airfields damaged, but operational. They left the submarines in Grand Harbour, ready to put to sea. And they left the war in the Mediterranean to the Italians, who had already proven they could not handle it alone. This was the mistake. This was the moment when the Germans handed Malta a second chance at life. The summer of 1941 was Malta's resurrection. With the Luftwaffe gone, the island's offensive capabilities grew exponentially. RAF bombers struck at Italian shipping by day and night. Submarines of the 10th Flotilla slipped out of Valletta harbour to hunt convoys in the Sicilian Channel. And in October, the Royal Navy established Force K, a strike force of cruisers and destroyers based at Malta with one mission: sink everything heading for North Africa. The results were catastrophic for the Axis. In November 1941, British forces destroyed 60% of all supplies bound for Rommel's Africa cause. Force K alone, in a single night attack, sank 7 German merchant ships and an escorting destroyer. The Italians temporarily halted all convoy operations. Rommel's tanks ran out of fuel. His artillery ran out of shells. His advance ground to a halt. And Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had seemed unstoppable just months before, was forced to watch his army starve. Malta's submarines were even more devastating. The 10th Submarine Flotilla never numbered more than 12 boats. But between January 1941 and December 1942, those 12 submarines sank over 400,000 tons of Axis shipping. They sank troop transports. They sank tankers. They sank ammunition ships. On a single patrol in May 1941, the submarine HMS Upholder torpedoed the liner Conte Rosso and sent 1,800 Italian soldiers to the bottom of the Mediterranean. By the autumn of 1941, the German Naval Liaison Staff in Rome was using the word catastrophic to describe the supply situation. British forces based on Malta were destroying ships faster than Italy could build them. Rommel's advance into Egypt had become a logistical impossibility, and the tiny island that was supposed to be neutralized in weeks had become the most dangerous threat to Axis operations in the entire Mediterranean. The Germans had made a choice. They had chosen Russia over Malta. They had chosen Moscow over Cairo, and now they were paying the price. But the Axis was not finished. In December 1941, the Luftwaffe returned. Fliegerkorps II, transferred from the Eastern Front after the failure to capture Moscow, brought 325 aircraft to Sicily. Stukas, Junkers, Ju-88s, Heinkel torpedo bombers, Messerschmitt fighters. They came with a simple objective: bomb Malta into oblivion. This time, there would be no half measures. The Blitz of 1942 was different from anything Malta had experienced before. The Germans attacked day and night, around the clock, without pause. In January alone, they flew over 260 raids. In February, the tempo increased. In March, it increased again. By April, Malta was receiving more bombs per square mile than any place had ever received in any comparable time period. More than London during the Blitz, more than Coventry, more than Warsaw or Rotterdam. The airfields were hit hardest: Tarkali, Lucca, Halfar. The runways were cratered faster than they could be repaired. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground, blown apart in their revetments, burned in their hangars. In January 1942, the RAF lost 50 Hurricanes on the ground alone. Only 28 fighters remained on the entire island. By April, there were days when Malta had only 7 Spitfires capable of flying. The harbours were next. The dockyards that had saved Illustrious were pounded into rubble. The submarines that had terrorized Axis convoys were bombed in their pens. Force K, the strike force that had strangled Rommel's supply lines, was virtually destroyed. The cruiser Neptune hit a mine and sank with the loss of over 700 men. The destroyer Kandahar was mined and scuttled. The surviving ships were so badly damaged they had to be withdrawn to Alexandria and Gibraltar. Malta's offensive capability was gone, and then the supplies ran out. The convoys that had kept Malta alive could no longer get through. In February, 3 merchant ships tried to reach the island from Alexandria. None of them made it. In March, 4 ships tried. 1 arrived, badly damaged. In June, 2 convoys sailed simultaneously from Gibraltar and Egypt. Of 17 merchant ships, only 2 reached Malta. The rest were sunk or forced to turn back. The island began to starve. Civilians were put on rations of 1,500 calories a day. Bread was made from barley and potato flour. Sugar disappeared. Meat disappeared. Even water was rationed. The military situation was even worse. There was no fuel for the aircraft that remained. There was no ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns. There was no way to repair the damage from the daily bombing. April 1942 was the darkest month. The Germans flew over 400 raids. They dropped over 6,700 tons of bombs on Grand Harbour alone. The island's defences were at breaking point. The food would run out in weeks. The ammunition would run out in days. Kesselring, the German commander, reported to Berlin that Malta had been neutralized. The Axis began planning the invasion. And then, on April 15th, 1942, King George VI did something unprecedented. He awarded the George Cross to the entire island of Malta. It was the highest civilian honour in the British Empire. It had never been given to a collective group before. The king wrote a letter to the governor. To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history. It was a gesture. It was a piece of paper. But it mattered. It told the people of Malta that the world was watching. It told them that their suffering had meaning. It told them that they were not alone. The invasion never came. Hitler had been planning Operation Hercules, a combined German and Italian airborne and seaborne assault on Malta, for months. The paratroopers were ready. The landing craft were assembled. The date was set for July, but then Rommel captured Tobruk on June 21st, and everything began to change. With the fall of Tobruk, Rommel suddenly had fuel. He had captured thousands of tons of British supplies. He had momentum. He wanted to push on to Cairo, to the Suez Canal, to final victory in North Africa. He convinced Hitler that he could finish the job if he moved fast, before the British could recover. Hitler, who had always been skeptical of the risks of an airborne assault on Malta, was easily persuaded. But it was not until the First Battle of El Alamein stalled Rommel's advance in July that the decision became final. Operation Hercules was shelved indefinitely. The invasion of Malta would never happen. It was another mistake. It was perhaps the fatal mistake. Because while Rommel raced toward Egypt, the British were preparing one last desperate effort to save Malta. Operation Pedestal, launched in August 1942, was the most heavily protected convoy of the entire war. 14 merchant ships, 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, 32 destroyers, every available warship in the Mediterranean. The Axis threw everything at it: submarines, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, surface ships, mines. They sank the aircraft carrier Eagle. They sank 9 of the 14 merchant ships. They damaged almost every warship in the convoy, but 5 ships got through, and one of them was the tanker Ohio, carrying 11,000 tons of fuel oil, the lifeblood Malta needed to survive. Ohio was hit by bombs. She was hit by torpedoes. She was hit by a crashing German bomber that embedded itself in her deck. Her engines failed. Her back was broken. She was sinking, but she did not sink. 2 destroyers lashed themselves to her sides and dragged her into Grand Harbour on August 15th, 1942, the feast day of Santa Maria. The people of Malta lined the walls of the harbour and cheered. The siege was not over, but the crisis had passed. Malta would survive, and Malta would fight. In September 1942, with the island resupplied, British forces based on Malta went back on the offensive. They sank 100,000 tons of Axis shipping in a single month. They cut Rommel's supply lines at the worst possible moment. In October, when Bernard Montgomery launched the Battle of El Alamein, the Africa Corps was gravely short of fuel, short of ammunition, short of everything it needed to fight. Rommel's tanks had enough gasoline for 3 days of combat. Montgomery's had enough for 3 weeks. The math had finally caught up with the Desert Fox. El Alamein was the turning point. The British victory broke the back of the Africa Corps. And Malta, the island that was supposed to be destroyed, the island that absorbed more bombs per square mile than any other place in the war, the island that refused to die, had made that victory possible. The Axis forces in North Africa surrendered in May 1943. 230,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity, and from Malta's airfields and harbours, the Allies launched the next phase of the war. The invasion of Sicily, the invasion of Italy, the slow, bloody advance up the Italian peninsula that would not end until May 1945. The numbers from the siege are almost incomprehensible. 3,340 air raids over 2.5 years, over 30,000 buildings destroyed or damaged, 1,581 civilians killed, 3,700 wounded, 70% of the churches on the island reduced to rubble. The Royal Air Force lost over 500 aircraft. The Royal Navy lost over 4,000 sailors and submariners. The Merchant Navy lost 200 men trying to keep Malta supplied. But the numbers on the other side were worse. The submarines of the 10th Flotilla alone sank over 400,000 tons of shipping. Malta-based aircraft sank another 250,000. Force K and other surface forces added tens of thousands more. When the siege ended in November 1942, the Axis had lost the equivalent of an entire army's worth of equipment to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Tanks that never reached Rommel, artillery that never fired a shot, fuel that burned on the surface of the sea instead of powering panzer divisions in the desert. The mistake Germany made in 1941 was not attacking Malta. The mistake was not finishing the job. The mistake was withdrawing the Luftwaffe in May to prepare for Barbarossa, leaving the island wounded but alive. The mistake was shelving Operation Hercules in July 1942, gambling that Rommel could win in Egypt before Malta recovered. The mistake was underestimating what a handful of submarines and bombers operating from an unsinkable aircraft carrier could do to an army that depended on supplies shipped across a hostile sea. Erwin Rommel understood. In May 1941, he had warned them. Without Malta, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa. He was right. They did not take Malta, and they lost North Africa. And losing North Africa led to the invasion of Sicily. And Sicily led to Italy. And Italy led to the collapse of Mussolini's fascist state. And the collapse of Italy tied down German divisions that might have been fighting in Normandy or on the Eastern Front. The failure to take Malta was not just a tactical error. It was a strategic catastrophe that rippled through the rest of the war. Today, if you visit Malta, you will see the scars. You will see the George Cross on the national flag, the only nation in the world to display a Medal of Honor as part of its identity. You will see the restored buildings of Valletta, the rebuilt churches of the 3 cities, the memorials to the sailors and airmen and civilians who died in the siege. You will see Faith, the last surviving gladiator, displayed in the National War Museum, a symbol of defiance that grew larger than the aircraft itself. And if you look out at the blue Mediterranean from the walls of Grand Harbour, you might imagine what it was like in the spring of 1942. The sirens wailing, the Stukas screaming, the bombs falling like rain on a city that had already been bombed 1,000 times, and the people of Malta, hungry, exhausted, terrified, looking up at the sky and refusing to surrender. The mistake Germany. made was thinking that an island could be bombed into submission. The mistake was thinking that courage could be measured in tonnage. The mistake was believing that will could be broken by explosives. Malta proved them wrong. A rock in the middle of the sea, smaller than a medium-sized city, held out against the most powerful air forces in the world. It absorbed everything they could throw at it. And then, when the bombs stopped falling, it struck back. That is why the attack on Malta was a huge mistake. Not because it failed militarily, though it did. Not because it cost thousands of lives and hundreds of aircraft, though it did. But because it revealed something about the limits of air power, about the resilience of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure, about what happens when you give your enemy time to recover and a reason to fight. The Germans dropped enough bombs on Malta to destroy a continent. Malta is still there. The siege is over. The memory remains. And somewhere, in the deep blue water of the Mediterranean, in the rusting hulks of German and Italian ships, lies the price of the mistake that cost the Axis the war.